The colony of Ashen Vale. Location: Ashen Vale Station, Outer Drift, Calarian System. Year: 2847 CE. The first thing they told Zevra Okafor when she arrived at Ashen Vale Station was that humans did not belong in the forge halls. The second thing they told her was that she would clean them. Zevra had crossed 11 light-years in a cryopod no larger than a supply crate, clutching a datapad with a single job offer scrawled in the Calarian trade script she had spent 4 months learning. Maintenance Technician, Grade 3, Ashen Vale Fabrication Hub. She had memorized every word. She had thought it meant something. It did not mean what she thought. Ashen Vale was a joint-species industrial station orbiting the twin gas giants of the Calarian system. 6 alien species called it home. Humans were the 7th and newest, and the Calarioni Forge Guild had made it clear that humanity's role was auxiliary. Floor maintenance, coolant flushing, hauling slag. Nothing that required a certified neural link to the station's fabrication lattice. Nothing that required a forge crest, the iridescent emblem tattooed along the neck of every sanctioned smith. Zevra had one anyway. She had forged it herself, a fake, printed on a patch of synth skin, pressed against her collarbone where the station scanners would catch the signal. It had gotten her through 3 checkpoints before a guild inspector named Doric Vell noticed that the resonance signature was 7 years out of calibration. He had not reported her. "You printed that from a 2840 schema," he said, when he found her mopping coolant behind Forge Bay 12. His species, the Velthari, stood 3 meters tall, with 4 arms and a bony crest that shifted color with mood. Right now his crest was a deep, unreadable violet. The guild updated its encryption in 2841. "You were close." "Close doesn't open doors," Zevra said. "No," he agreed. "But it tells me you understand fabrication at a structural level. Most maintenance grades don't know what a resonance signature is." She wrung out the mop. "What do you want?" "To understand why a human would travel 11 light-years to sweep floors." She looked at him. Really looked the way her father had taught her to look at people when you needed to know if they were worth the truth. Doric Vell's crest had shifted from violet to a pale, cautious amber. She decided to answer honestly. "I'm a materials engineer," she said. "Back on Earth, I spent 6 years studying bone composite reinforcement. Biological load-bearing structures. The way organisms evolve materials stronger than anything we can synthesize. My research grant was cancelled. The university sold the lab. I had nothing left to study, except that there was a species out here, the Velthari, who have been forging alloy bone hybrid armor for 2,000 years. I came to learn." The amber deepened to something almost gold. "The guild does not teach humans," he said. "I know," Zevra said. "That's why I'm sweeping floors. I can learn a lot standing next to a furnace." Doric Vell was silent for a long time. The forge hall groaned around them, massive hydraulic presses cycling, articulated drone arms carrying glowing billets of ore, the deep resonant hum of the lattice as it calculated stress distributions in real time. Zevra had stood in that hum for 3 weeks now, and every day she understood it a little better. "The guild is hosting the triennial forging trial in 6 weeks, Doric said finally. "Any certified smith may enter. The winner receives a journeyman elevation and access to the restricted archive, the oldest fabrication records in the Calarian system." "I'm not certified," Zevra said. "No. But there is a secondary category. The open challenge. Any being may enter, certified or not. The entry requirement is simple: present a material sample to the judging panel. If they deem it worthy of trial, you compete." He reached into a satchel at his hip and produced a fragment of something pale and dense, a shard no larger than Zevra's fist, with a cross-hatched internal structure visible at the broken edge. She recognized it instantly. Trabecular bone. But not from any animal she knew. The struts were too regular, the spacing too precise. "This is from a creature called a hollowback titan," Doric said. "It died in the Outer Drift 3 centuries ago. Its skeleton is the densest naturally occurring material we have ever cataloged. We have never been able to synthesize it. Every attempt to replicate the internal architecture has failed." He paused. "You said you study biological load-bearing structures." Zevra took the shard. It was heavier than it looked. She turned it in her hands, feeling the weight distribution, pressing her thumbnail against the surface. It did not scratch. "You're not supposed to show me this," she said. "No," Doric agreed. "I am also not supposed to notice that a human maintenance grade understands fabrication resonance well enough to fake a guild crest. The world is full of things we are not supposed to do." Zevra pocketed the shard. That night, in her bunk in the human sector dormitory, She laid the fragment on the shelf above her head and stared at it in the dark. Around her, 17 other maintenance workers breathed in the rhythms of exhausted sleep. Someone had taped a printed photograph to the ceiling, a mountain range, snow-capped, green-footed. A reminder of somewhere better. Zevra did not look at the photograph. She looked at the bone. 6 weeks. A restricted archive containing 2,000 years of Velthari fabrication knowledge. And a fragment of material that no species in the Calarian system had been able to understand. She had no forge access. No certified tools. No guild crest. She had a mop, a materials engineering degree, and 3 weeks of standing next to furnaces listening to the lattice hum. She got up, sat cross-legged on her bunk and opened her data pad. She started taking notes. The education of Ash. Location: Maintenance Sublevel 7, Ashen Vale Station, Week 2 of 6. The station's medical bay discarded biological waste through a recycling chute on Sublevel 7. Most of it was incinerated. Some of it, the denser refuse, the implant castings, the bone fragments from surgical procedures, was routed through a secondary compactor. Zevra intercepted it before the compactor ran. She was not supposed to be in Sublevel 7 after her shift. Her access badge logged every movement, and she had learned quickly that the guild's security system flagged any maintenance grade who lingered in non-assigned zones for longer than 12 minutes. She gave herself 11. In 11 minutes she collected fragments. Bones from 6 different species. Shell casings from a Grethales molted exoskeleton. The Grethali shed twice a year, and their chitinous shell was one of the toughest biological materials in the Calarian system, though it was brittle under torsional stress. Calcified cartilage from a Velthari surgical removal. And, on her 8th visit, pressed into a corner behind a coolant pipe, one additional fragment of hollowback titan bone, smaller than a thumbnail, that someone had used as a sample substrate for a metallurgical test and then discarded. Back in the dormitory after lights out, she worked. She had no lap. She had a data pad, a multi-tool kit rated for maintenance work, a handheld spectrometer she had borrowed from the supply locker, signed out for calibration, due back in 48 hours, and the knowledge in her head, 6 years of it, dense as the bone she was studying. The hollowback titan skeleton was extraordinary not because of what it was made of, but because of how it was made. The mineral composition was similar to biological hydroxyapatite, calcium phosphate, the same compound in human bone, but the crystalline structure was oriented in ways that defied standard biomechanical models. In human bone, collagen fibers ran in alternating directions between layers, distributing stress. In Titan bone, the fibers didn't just alternate. They spiraled. And the spirals changed pitch in response to compressive load. A living material, still active even after 3 centuries of death, its piezoelectric properties preserving the structural memory of every impact it had ever absorbed. That was what the guild had missed. They had been trying to synthesize the material, to replicate its composition. But the material wasn't the point. The architecture was. Zevra spent 4 nights just mapping the spiral geometry, using the spectrometer's imaging mode and a set of hand-drawn diagrams on her datapad. By the 5th night she had a model. By the 7th, she had identified the flaw in every guild synthesis attempt she had been able to observe from the floor of Forge Bay 12. They were building the mineral matrix first, then trying to introduce the fiber architecture. But the Titan's bone grew from the inside out. The fibers formed first, the mineral crystal nucleated around them, and the whole structure self-organized under biological loading stress. You couldn't forge it. You had to grow it. The question was how to grow it without 300 years and a living hollowback Titan. Her answer came from an unlikely source. On her 9th day in Sublevel 7, she found the exoskeleton fragments of a Grethali juvenile, a mold from what must have been a child based on the size. The juvenile Grethali shell had something the adult shell lacked: incomplete mineralization. The chitin fibers were still partially exposed, still flexible, not yet locked into the brittle adult matrix. In nature, the juvenile Grethali shell hardened when the animal began to move, when physical loading triggered mineral deposition. The fibers oriented themselves under stress before they calcified. The end result was a shell custom-tuned to that individual's movement patterns. Zevra stared at the juvenile fragment for a long time. Then she went back to her datapad and started designing something that was not a forge weapon, not an alloy plate, not any category of object the guild's triennial trial had ever seen before. She was going to grow a blade. The concept was straightforward, the execution was not. She needed a scaffold, something with the correct fiber geometry to guide mineral deposition. She needed a mineral solution, calcium phosphate, available in the station's medical bay supply stores, listed as a bone repair compound and theoretically accessible to a maintenance grade with the right forms. She needed a loading apparatus, something that would apply controlled mechanical stress to the scaffold as it mineralized, the way a living body would. And she needed time, not 300 years, but if her model was correct, possibly as few as 3 weeks. She had 4. The scaffold she built from grethylene chitin fibers, which she carefully separated by hand under a magnifying lens, relaying them in the Titan spiral geometry using a pattern she had memorized from her own diagrams. It took 9 nights and destroyed her fingernails down to nothing. The mineral solution she requested through a medical supply form, citing coolant pipe corrosion as the justification. Calcium phosphate was also used as a pipe coating compound in certain reactive environments, and the form didn't require supervisor sign-off below a certain volume. The loading apparatus she built from salvaged maintenance components. A tension spring from a broken drone arm, 2 bracket clamps, a length of vibration damping cable, and a small electromagnetic oscillator she found in a bin of decommissioned calibration equipment. It would apply a cyclic compressive load to the scaffold, 18 cycles per minute, mimicking the breathing rhythm of an animal at rest. She set it running under her bunk on the 14th night. She lay above it and listened to the soft rhythmic click of the tension spring cycling. Around her, the other maintenance workers slept. The photograph of the mountain range caught the faint light from the door panel. Zevra closed her eyes. She was not building a weapon. She was building proof that the way humans thought about materials was different from the way the guild thought, and that different was not lesser. She was building an argument, made of bone and time and 17 nights of stolen sleep. She hoped the judges would understand arguments. She was fairly sure they wouldn't. She was also fairly sure it didn't matter. The restricted archive held 2,000 years of fabrication knowledge. Even if she lost, if she could get inside, if she could see even a fraction of what was there, it would be worth every moment of this. The spring clicked. The mineral solution wickered slowly up through the chitin scaffold. Zevra slept. The open challenge. Location: Grand Forge Hall, Ashen Vale Station, day of the triennial trial. The Grand Forge Hall was the largest enclosed space on Ashen Vale Station, a cathedral of industry, its ceiling lost in drifting heat haze, its floor a mosaic of alloy plate and cooling channels. Spectator galleries ringed the upper walls. The triennial trial drew beings from across the Calarian system, guild masters from Velthari Prime, trade observers from the Gretheli Conclave, a delegation of Osirai scholars who studied fabrication history, and hundreds of private spectators who had paid considerable sums for gallery access. None of them had come to see a human. Zevra registered for the open challenge at the secondary entry desk, a folding table near a side door, staffed by a single guild administrator who looked at her the way people looked at things they did not expect to have to deal with. The registration form asked for her material sample. She produced it from a padded case she had constructed from dormitory supply foam. The blade was 22 centimeters long, 3 centimeters wide at its broadest point, tapering to a fine edge. It was pale, not white exactly but the color of old ivory, with a faint iridescent shimmer visible in strong light where the spiral fiber geometry caught the photons at oblique angles. It looked, to anyone who had not studied biomaterials, like a carved piece of bone. Which it was. Mostly. The administrator held it up, turned it, looked uncertain. "What alloy is the base matrix?" she asked. "It's not an alloy," Zevra said. "It's a biological composite. Gretheli chitin scaffold, mineralized with oriented calcium phosphate under cyclic mechanical loading. The fiber geometry is modeled on hollowback Titan trabecular architecture." A long pause. "There is no certification category for biological composites," the administrator said. "The open challenge has no category restrictions," Zevra said. "I checked. 3 times. Another pause. Then the administrator stamped her form and handed her a competitor's badge, the lowest tier, a plain disc with no guild insignia. She pinned it to her jacket and walked into the hall. The certified smiths were already at their stations, great forge benches loaded with tooling, connected to the lattice network, surrounded by the guild's finest equipment. Velthari smiths with forearmed precision. Osirai craftspeople whose sensory tendrils could feel stress concentrations at the molecular level. A single Gretheli master who had won the trial 3 times before. 16 competitors in all. They glanced at the human who had walked in through the side door. Most looked away again immediately. Doric Vel did not look away. He stood at his forge bench near the far wall, and when he saw Zevra, his crest shifted briefly to gold. The trial began with the presentation round. Each competitor submitted their primary work to the judging panel for initial evaluation. The panel consisted of 5 guild masters, 3 Velthari, 1 Asurai, 1 Grethali, seated at a curved bench at the head of the hall. The works were assessed for material quality, fabrication method, structural integrity, and innovation. Zevra was called last as the only open challenge entrant. She walked to the panel's bench and placed the blade before them. The reaction was immediate and instructive. The Asurai panelist leaned forward, tendrils extending toward the blade without touching it, reading its electromagnetic signature, its structural resonance, the patterns of stress locked into its crystalline matrix. The Velthari panelists exchanged a look. The Grethali master picked the blade up, turned it in her claws and set it down slowly. "This is not forged," the head panelist said. Guild Master Tareth Orin, Velthari, ancient, with a crest so deeply colored it had lost the ability to shift. "This is grown. You grew this?" "Yes," Zevra said. "On a fabrication station," he said, "without forge access." "In a maintenance dormitory," she said. "Under my bunk." The hall had gone quiet. The gallery spectators were leaning forward. "The open challenge requires that the submitted work demonstrate fabrication capability," Tareth Orin said. "Not biology. Not gardening. Fabrication." "With respect," Zevra said, "I would like to dispute that distinction." She had prepared for this. She had rehearsed it 17 times in the dormitory while the spring clicked below her. Fabrication is the application of knowledge to materials to produce structures with intended properties. That is what I did. The method was biological rather than thermomechanical, but the underlying principle is identical. I identified a material architecture, modeled it, built a scaffold to guide its formation, and applied controlled mechanical loading to produce a finished structure with specific mechanical properties. The result is standing before you. Test it. Tareth Orin looked at the blade for a long time. Then he nodded to the Asurai panelist. What followed was 40 minutes of testing that Zevra watched from the side of the hall, arms folded, heart rate absolutely not elevated. They ran the blade through the standard guild battery, compressive loading to failure threshold. It did not fail at loads that would have cracked conventional ceramic composites. Torsional stress. It flexed slightly, absorbed the load and returned to form without fracture. Impact resistance. Thermal stability. Edge retention. And finally, the lattice scan, the station's fabrication intelligence analyzing the material's internal structure, mapping its architecture. The lattice scan took 11 minutes. This was unusual. Most materials were mapped in under 2. When it completed, Tareth Orin read the results on his panel screen. His crest, which had not shifted in living memory, turned amber. "The internal architecture," he said carefully, "is a functional analog of hollowback Titan trabecular bone. The fiber geometry is within 4% of the optimal theoretical model. No guild synthesis has achieved within 30%. He set down the panel screen. "In 42 triennial trials, no open challenge entry has ever been advanced to the competition round." Zevra waited. "You are advanced to the competition round," he said. The hall erupted. Not in applause, in argument, in the overlapping frequencies of 6 species: protest and fascination and disbelief. Doric Vel's crest blazed gold across the room. Zevra exhaled very slowly and went to find her competition station. It was a bare bench near the back wall. No lattice connection. No guild tooling. She set her padded case down and got to work. What bone remembers? Location: Grand Forge Hall, competition floor, hours 3 through 7 of the trial. The competition round of the triennial trial lasted a full standard day. Competitors were given a challenge substrate. In this cycle, a fractured load-bearing strut recovered from a collapsed deep space habitat, and asked to produce a repair solution using their submitted material and methodology. The solution would be tested under conditions replicating the original habitat's stress environment. For 16 certified smiths, this was a metallurgical problem. They had lattice access, forge temperatures, and centuries of accumulated guild technique. They began immediately, the hall filling with the orange light of active forges, the crack and hiss of quenched tanks, the deep harmonics of the lattice calculating stress distributions. Zevra had none of that. She had the blade she had already made, which she was not going to destroy. She had her tools. She had the case. And this was the part that had taken the most thought, a second growth substrate set running 10 days before the trial, which she had been carrying in an insulated container at the bottom of her maintenance kit for 2 weeks. The second substrate was not a blade. It was a patch, a flat panel of the same chitin mineral composite, grown to a thickness of 8 millimeters, measuring approximately 15 centimeters by 20. It was not finished. That had been intentional. She had stopped the mineralization process at 70% completion, leaving the scaffold partially flexible, not yet fully crystallized, its fiber architecture locked in but its mineral matrix still capable of taking new form under load. She inspected the fractured strut. Aluminum titanium matrix, common construction alloy, failed at a fatigue crack that had propagated from a weld joint. The fracture surface was irregular, not a clean break she could simply bridge, but a complex topology that a flat patch could not address directly. Most of the smiths were fabricating replacement sections. Cut out the damaged region, forge a new piece to specification, bond it in. Effective. Standard guild practice. Zevra looked at the fracture surface for a long time. Then she opened her case and began preparing her composite panel. The key property of a 70% mineralized Grethely Titan composite was the same property that made juvenile Grethely shell so remarkable. It would continue to mineralize under load. If she could apply the panel to the fracture surface while it was still plastic, and then load it, the panel would conform to the fracture topology, its fibers orienting under stress, its mineral matrix completing around the exact geometry of the joint. It would not be a patch. It would be a perfect fit repair, custom grown to the fracture surface, mechanically locked in place by the same architecture that gave hollowback Titans their legendary structural integrity. She had thought of this 11 days ago. The execution had one significant problem. The panel needed to be held in place under controlled load while it completed mineralization. In a maintenance dormitory, she had used a spring apparatus. Here, on a competition bench with no guild tooling, she needed something else. She used herself. More precisely, she used the weight of her body, lying prone on the bench, pressing the prepared composite panel against the fracture surface with both hands, distributing load across her palms, controlling the pressure by feel. She had practiced this in the dormitory. She knew exactly how much force was needed, where to apply it, how to shift her weight as the panel began to conform. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing the guild's judging panel had ever seen on a competition floor. The certified smiths at their forge stations glanced over and then glanced away, clearly deciding that whatever the human was doing was too strange to evaluate. Doric Vel watched the whole time. His crest never shifted from gold. It took 4 hours. Zevra did not move for 4 hours except to make small adjustments to load distribution, tracking the composite's progress by feel, the way the panel's compliance changed as the mineral matrix set, the way it transitioned from plastic to rigid, the way the bond between composite and alloy substrate developed as the growing crystal structure mechanically interlocked with the metal's surface roughness. Her back ached. Her arms burned. At hour 3, a maintenance-grade worker she did not know appeared beside her bench with a cup of water and set it down without speaking. She was not able to drink it without moving her hands. At hour 4, the panel was set. She lifted herself off the bench carefully, straightened up, flexed her fingers. The repaired strut lay on the bench, the composite patch fully bonded, pale against the dark alloy, its iridescent shimmer visible in the forge light. She picked it up, turned it, ran her thumbnail along the bond line. Seamless. The composite had conformed so precisely to the fracture surface that the bond was invisible from above. She submitted it to the panel for testing. The results came back 2 hours later, while the other competitors were still working. The repaired strut had been loaded to 412% of its original rated capacity before the testing apparatus reached its own limit. The repair joint had not failed. The alloy had failed first, not at the repair site but 20 centimeters away in the original material. The composite patch had become the strongest part of the strut. Tereth Oren called the competition round early. He had never done that before either. Zevra stood at her bench as the forges cycled down around her and the hall fell into a strange, attentive silence. The guild masters conferred at their curved bench for 12 minutes. The gallery spectators had stopped talking entirely. She could hear the station's deep background hum, the fabrication lattice, always calculating, always running its stress models. She thought about her father. He had been an orthopedic surgeon on Earth, a man who spent his days repairing the load-bearing structures of human bodies, bone by careful bone. He had taught her to look at bone the way other people looked at engineering drawings, as solved problems, millions of years of iteration compressed into structure. Every trabecular strut in a human femur was where it was because every other position had been tested and failed. Nature did not draft designs. Nature ran trials. She had run a trial. Under her bunk. In a maintenance dormitory 11 light years from home. The guild masters stopped conferring. Tereth Oren rose. The archive. Location: Ashen Vale Station. Restricted Archive, Level 1. 14 days after the trial. They did not give her the journeyman elevation. They gave her something that had no name because it had never existed before. The Guild's charter, written 2,000 years ago in the first generation of the Calarian Forge Alliance, included a clause that had never been invoked. It read, in the original Velthary, something that translated roughly as, in the event that a being demonstrates fabrication mastery through means outside the Guild's established categories, the Masters may grant recognition at their collective discretion, with the full rights and archive access thereof. The clause had been written as a formality, a hedge against the possibility that the Guild's founders had not imagined every possible method of fabrication. They had not imagined Zevra Okafor. The recognition ceremony was brief, which suited Zevra fine. Terath Orin affixed a recognition mark to her documentation, not a forge crest, not a journeyman badge, but a new symbol that the Guild's recording secretary had to design on the spot, a spiral because of the fiber geometry. She was the only being in the Calarian system who wore it. Doric Vel attended the ceremony. His crest was gold the entire time. The restricted archive occupied 3 levels of a sealed section of the station, accessible only by Guild recognition. The door accepted Zevra's new documentation without hesitation, a small mechanical fact that nonetheless made her throat tight. She walked in alone. The archive was not what she had expected. She had imagined something grand, towering shelves, physical records, the weight of 2,000 years made tangible. What she found was a series of quiet rooms with low lighting and interface terminals, each terminal connected to the Guild's deep storage network. The records were digital, but digital did not mean simple. The earliest files, from the founding generation of Velthary Smiths, were stored in a format that required specialist translation software and took the terminal 17 seconds to render. She watched the progress bar and felt 2,000 years pressing against the screen. She started at the beginning. What she found in those first files was both more and less than she had hoped for. The early Velthary Smiths had known about biological materials, had incorporated them into their fabrication work from the very start, long before the Guild codified its metallurgical focus. There were records of attempts to work with hollowback Titan bone in the first century of the Guild's existence, and detailed notes on why those attempts had failed. The early Smiths had understood at an intuitive level that the bone's architecture was the key, but they had lacked the analytical tools to map it precisely, and they had lacked the concept of guided mineralization. They had been close. They had been very close. And then, in the 2nd century, a different kind of record appeared. A political history. The Guild had formalized. Certification requirements had been introduced. The definition of fabrication had been codified in ways that excluded biological methods, not out of ignorance but out of economics. Biological growth was slow. It was unpredictable. It required different training, different infrastructure, different ways of thinking about time. The Guild's clients wanted consistent output on predictable schedules. Forge metallurgy delivered that. Biology did not. The knowledge had not been forgotten. It had been filed away. Put in the restricted archive, accessible only to those who had already proven they did not need it. Zevra read for 6 hours without stopping. On the 2nd day, Doric Vel came to the archive entrance and asked permission to enter. She was not sure she had the authority to grant it, but she waved him in anyway. He was quiet for a long time, reading over her shoulder. "You knew it was here," she said. "The biological fabrication research. You knew the archive had it." "I suspected," he said. "I had access to the archive as a senior smith, but I lacked the training to interpret what I found. The early records are in a dialect of Old Velthary that requires specialist translation. I could see that there were files. I could not read them." He paused. "When you arrived, when I saw your false crest and understood what it meant, I thought perhaps you could." "You waited 6 years," she said. "You've been a senior smith for 6 years. You could have found a translator." "I could have," he said. "But translators translate words. You translated meaning." His crest had settled into a steady, warm gold. "There is a difference." She turned back to the terminal. "I need to share this. All of it. The early research, my own methodology, everything. The Guild needs to understand that biological fabrication isn't an alternative to forge metallurgy. It's a complement. There are structural problems that thermomechanical methods cannot solve. There are repair applications, adaptive materials, load-responsive composites that could change habitat construction, ship design, medical implant architecture. "The Guild will resist," Doric said. "I know." She had known since the 2nd night under her bunk, when she had lain listening to the spring click and thought through every possible outcome. Resistance is fine. I'm not asking the guild to change its methods. I'm asking it to expand its definition of fabrication. That's a different argument, and it's one I have 2,000 years of their own research to support. You will write a paper, he said. I will write several. Starting with a methodology document on guided biological mineralization, something any materials engineer with basic equipment can replicate. No forge required. No lattice connection. No guild certification. She paused. Maintenance-grade clearance will suffice. Doric Vel's crest, which had been gold for 2 weeks, shifted for the first time, into something she had never seen on a Velthary before, a color she had no name for, somewhere between gold and white. My species has a word for that color, she said. What word? He asked. Dawn. She published the first paper 11 days later. It circulated through the guild's internal network before the senior masters could decide whether to suppress it, and by the time they convened to discuss the matter, it had already been downloaded by 47 junior smiths, 3 Osiri scholars, a Grethely materials researcher, and, through a data relay that Zevra had not arranged herself but did not discourage, the open academic networks beyond the Calarian system. Within 6 months, a human graduate student on Callisto wrote to her about replicating the methodology. Within a year, a Grethely materials lab had produced the first fully synthetic Titan architecture composite using guided biological mineralization. Within 3 years, the guild had established a new certification track, biological fabrication, the first new track in 400 years, and Zevra Okafor, maintenance grade, materials engineer, was its inaugural instructor. The dormitory still had 17 other workers sleeping in it. The photograph of the mountain range was still taped to the ceiling. But Zevra's bunk was empty now. She had moved to a researcher's quarters on level 4. She left the photograph where it was. Someone else might need the reminder of where they were from. She had a different reminder now, a pale, iridescent blade 22 centimeters long, sitting on the shelf above her new desk. Not a weapon. An argument. Proof. A thing grown slowly, under pressure, in the dark, from materials no one thought worth keeping. She had been told to forge a blade. She had sharpened bone instead. And the edge she had put on it would cut for a very long time.